If your family has been in the Carolinas a long time, there is a decent chance your name did not start in Charleston, and it did not start on a rice plantation near the coast. It started somewhere rougher, further inland, in a stretch of red clay and pine ridges that 18th century officials simply called the Backcountry. That word matters more than most people realize. The Low Country and the Backcountry were, for most of the 1700s, almost two separate colonies sharing one name on a map. Different languages got spoken around different dinner tables, different churches, different courts, different reasons for crossing an ocean in the first place. This video is 14 specific surnames tied to that inland world, the Carolina Backcountry stretching from the Waxhaws down through the upcountry of South Carolina and up into the Piedmont of North Carolina, and what each one can actually tell you if it happens to be sitting in your own family tree. Some of these families produced presidents and a vice president. A couple of them fought on the losing side of a war their neighbors won, sometimes against those same neighbors directly, close enough that the fighting happened on land one family had cleared and another family later inherited. I will flag which is which as we go, and where the record is thin versus where it is genuinely well documented, because in the backcountry those two categories are not always the ones you would expect. A surname that sounds obscure today might turn out to sit at the center of a documented battlefield or a founding congregation, while a name you would expect to find everywhere sometimes barely survives past a single tax list. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Before the 14 names, the geography needs a few minutes, because almost nothing else on this list makes sense without it. Charleston and the low country around it were settled early, by the 1670s. Built on rice and indigo and an economy that depended on enslaved labor at a scale the backcountry never approached in the same way. The backcountry, by contrast, barely had any European settlement at all until the 1740s and 50s, and then it filled up fast, in one of the largest internal migrations colonial America ever produced. Most of it came down what is now called the Great Wagon Road, a rutted trail running south out of Philadelphia and Lancaster, through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and down into the Carolina Piedmont. Families walked or rode wagons for hundreds of miles to get there, sometimes taking the better part of a season to do it, and they arrived in a handful of distinct streams that rarely mixed with each other in the early decades, kept apart as much by language and worship as by simple distance. By the time the Revolution arrived, the backcountry population had grown so quickly that it actually outnumbered the coastal low country in both Carolinas, even though political power in both colonies still sat firmly in Charleston and in the eastern courts of North Carolina, a mismatch that backcountry settlers resented openly, and that fed directly into more than one local uprising in the years before independence was even on the table. The largest stream was Scots-Irish Presbyterian families whose parents or grandparents had left Ulster in the north of Ireland, often after already leaving lowland Scotland a generation or two before that. They filled the Waxhaws region straddling the border of the two Carolinas, and the land around what became Mecklenburg County, and they brought their kirk sessions and their ordained ministers with them, which matters enormously for anyone doing this research today, since Presbyterian congregations kept unusually thorough written records of births, marriages, and admissions to communion, the same way Quaker meetings did further north. A second stream was German, Lutheran, and Reformed families out of the Rhineland Palatinate and the neighboring German states, some coming down that same wagon road and some arriving through Charleston itself before moving inland from there on their own. They settled thickly in what is now Lincoln, Catawba, and Cabarrus counties in North Carolina, clearing farmland along the same creeks and river forks that had drawn the Scots-Irish a few years earlier. And their church records, where they survive at all, were often kept entirely in German for the first 2 or 3 generations, which is a genuine practical obstacle for a descendant who has never seen the documents and assumes every colonial American record will simply be in English. A third and smaller stream was Highland Scots, Gaelic-speaking and often Episcopalian rather than Presbyterian, who did not come down the wagon road at all. They sailed directly from the western highlands into Wilmington and settled around Cross Creek, later renamed Fayetteville, and their political loyalties during the Revolution ran in a completely different direction from their Scots-Irish neighbors barely 100 miles away, which is one of the more genuinely interesting wrinkles in this whole story, and we will get to it directly when we reach those names. Keep those 3 streams in your head as we go: Scots-Irish Presbyterian, German Lutheran and Reformed, and Highland Scot, because the surnames on this list sort cleanly into them, and knowing which stream your name belongs to tells you almost as much as the surname itself does. One more thing before the names, because it will save you real time if you ever go looking. Backcountry counties changed shape constantly through the 1700s. which means the county your ancestor's deed was actually recorded in is very often not the county that land sits in today. Tryon County, North Carolina, existed for barely a decade before it was dissolved in 1779 and split into Lincoln and Rutherford counties, and a family that never physically moved an inch could show up under 3 different county names across 3 separate documents. Add to that the genuinely brutal reality that a number of backcountry courthouses burned at some point in their history, sometimes more than once, taking deed books and estate records with them, and you start to understand why so much of the useful evidence for this specific region lives not in county courthouses at all, but in church registers, in militia payrolls held by state archives, and in land grant applications filed with the colonial and then state government directly rather than the local county. That is where most of what follows actually comes from. South Carolina's old judicial districts add another layer of the same problem, since the 96th District and the Camden District both once covered enormous stretches of the upcountry that have since been carved into a dozen or more modern counties. So a family history that simply says 96th District could genuinely mean present-day land in any of several present-day counties, depending on exactly when and where the original grant was surveyed. 1. Calhoun. Patrick Calhoun brought his family down into the Waxhaws and then further into what became the Long Cane settlement in the 96th District of South Carolina, part of that first big Scots-Irish wave pushing into the upcountry. In February of 1760, during an ongoing frontier war with the Cherokee, a raiding party attacked the Long Cane community directly, killing a number of settlers, including Patrick's own mother, and the survivors scattered eastward for a season before eventually returning to rebuild what they had lost. Patrick Calhoun went on to serve in the South Carolina Provincial Assembly and later opposed ratification of the federal Constitution as a delegate representing his backcountry district, a position that put him at odds with much of the low country establishment. His son, John Caldwell Calhoun, grew up in that same Long Cane community and became one of the most consequential and controversial political figures in 19th century America, serving as vice president under 2 different presidents and becoming one of slavery's most committed defenders in the Senate. The family's documented arc, from a massacre survivor on the Long Cane frontier to the second highest office in the federal government, is about as complete a Carolina backcountry Scots-Irish story as exists anywhere on paper. The Long Cane settlement itself sat in territory that today falls across Abbeville and McCormick counties, and South Carolina's own colonial land grant records still show the original Calhoun family surveys along the creek that gave the settlement its name. 2. Pickens. Andrew Pickens grew up in that same Waxhaws and Long Cane world as the Calhoun family, part of the same tight Presbyterian settlement network, and became one of the more effective, and depending on who you ask, one of the more ruthless militia commanders the Southern backcountry produced during the Revolutionary War. He fought at Kettle Creek in Georgia in 1779, and later at Cowpens in South Carolina in January of 1781, where his militia's discipline under fire is credited by most historians as one of the specific reasons the battle went the way it did against a larger British force. The Cherokee reportedly called him Wizard Owl, a name that survives in more than one contemporary account. If your family carries this surname with roots anywhere in the old 96th District, you are looking at one of the backcountry's genuinely well-documented military names, with Pickens's own wartime correspondence and pension-era testimony from men who served under him both preserved in state and federal archives. After the war, he returned to civilian life at his home called Hopewell, near present-day Clemson, and negotiated more than one treaty directly with Cherokee leaders on behalf of the new state government, a role that put the same man on both sides of that frontier relationship at different points in his life. 3. Jackson. The Waxhaws settlement produced more than one future president, and Andrew Jackson's family is the most famous example by a wide margin. His parents, Andrew and Elizabeth Jackson, arrived from Ulster only a couple of years before he was born in 1767 into a Scots-Irish Presbyterian community that by then already included the Calhoun and Pickens families a few miles off in either direction. Jackson's own birthplace is genuinely disputed between the North Carolina and South Carolina sides of the Waxhaws line, an argument that both states still make today, and one that the surviving documentation has never fully settled. What is not disputed is the community itself, a specific and tightly interrelated cluster of Presbyterian families in one narrow stretch of the backcountry that, within 2 generations, produced an outsized and genuinely surprising share of the young nation's political leadership. Waxhaw Presbyterian Church, organized in the 1750s, still holds session records from the very congregation Jackson's own family would have worshipped alongside, and local historians have used those same records for generations trying to pin down exactly which side of the state line his mother was actually standing on the week he was born. 4. Polk. Thomas Polk was among the founding families of Mecklenburg County, part of the Sugaw Creek Presbyterian congregation that anchored that Scots-Irish settlement around what became the town of Charlotte. He is documented as a leading figure in the county's early militia organization and in the local resolutions passed against British authority in 1775, well before the war's official start. His descendant James Knox Polk, born a few decades later just across the line in North Carolina before the family later moved on to Tennessee, became the 11th President of the United States. The Polk name shows up repeatedly in Mecklenburg's earliest land grants and militia rolls, tightly woven into the same Presbyterian network as the Alexander and Craighead families who appear next on this list. A log structure associated with the family still stands near present-day Pineville, and family tradition holds that the Polks arrived in the colonies by way of Maryland before pushing further south into the Carolina Piedmont with the rest of the Sugaw Creek congregation. 5. Alexander. Hezekiah Alexander is one of the best documented founding figures of Mecklenburg County, a stonemason, landowner, and eventually a member of the state's Revolutionary Provincial Council, whose stone home still stands today as one of the oldest surviving structures in the region. The Alexander name appears constantly across Mecklenburg's early deed books, church admission rolls, and the surviving records surrounding the Mecklenburg Resolves of May 1775, an early and locally significant set of anti-British resolutions that, by local tradition at least, predates the National Declaration of Independence by more than a year. If your surname is Alexander with roots specifically in Mecklenburg County, you are very likely connected to one of that county's actual founding, land-owning Presbyterian families rather than a later arrival. Multiple Alexander men are also named among the local subscribers who helped establish Queen's College in Charlotte in the 1770s, one of the earliest chartered institutions of higher learning anywhere in the southern colonies, which gives some sense of how quickly this Presbyterian settlement moved from clearing land to building formal institutions. 6. Craighead. Alexander Craighead was a Presbyterian minister whose openly political sermons at the Sugaw Creek and Rocky River congregations through the 1750s helped set the tone for the backcountry's later revolutionary sentiment, arriving years before most of his own congregants' children ever picked up a musket. Historians researching the roots of Mecklenburg's early resistance rhetoric return to Craighead's preaching again and again as a documented starting point, since his sermons on covenant and resistance to unjust authority were preserved and referenced by later ministers in the same pulpit. The surname carries less national fame than Calhoun or Jackson, but within backcountry Presbyterian church history specifically, it is one of the more genuinely significant names on record, tied directly to a specific and traceable congregation rather than to the region in general. Craighead himself had already been forced out of one Pennsylvania pulpit for similarly pointed preaching before he ever came south, which means his own migration down the Great Wagon Road mirrors the same path so many of his eventual Mecklenburg congregants had already taken or would soon take themselves. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. 7. Barringer. Paul Barringer immigrated from the German Palatinate and settled in what was then Rowan County before that land was later reorganized into Cabarrus, part of the thick German Reformed and Lutheran settlement belt running through the central Piedmont. The Barringer name appears in German-language church registers from congregations that, for their first 2 or 3 generations, conducted services and kept their membership books entirely in German, a detail that trips up a great many descendants who assume every colonial American record they need will already be written in English. Later generations of the family anglicized their spoken language well before they anglicized the surname itself, which stayed recognizably German on paper for a long stretch, appearing in county tax lists decades after the family had otherwise assimilated into the wider backcountry community around them. A later descendant, Daniel Moreau Barringer, went on to serve in Congress, and as a United States diplomat in the 1800s, a rise from Palatine immigrant farmland to federal office that mirrors, on a smaller scale, the same climb the Calhoun family made out of the Waxhaws. 8. Ramsauer, sometimes recorded in English-language documents as Ramsor. Jacob Ramsor operated a grist mill in what became Lincoln County, and that mill gave its name to one of the ugliest fights of the entire Southern campaign, the Battle of Ramsor's Mill in June of 1780, where Loyalist and Patriot militia, largely drawn from the same German and Scots-Irish backcountry neighborhoods, fought each other directly rather than facing a British regular army at all that day. Neighbors killed neighbors that morning, in some accounts men who had grown up together on adjoining farms. The battlefield itself sat essentially on family land, and the surname's connection to the site is about as direct as backcountry documentation ever gets, with the mill's exact location still identified today by local historical markers. Because both sides that morning were largely local men wearing their own clothes rather than any uniform, accounts describe combatants marking themselves with a sprig of green in their hats or a strip of white paper, simply to tell friend from enemy in the chaos, a small documented detail that says a great deal about how thin the line actually was between the two sides fighting there. 9. Reinhardt. Part of the same German Reformed settlement cluster in Lincoln and Catawba counties, the Reinhardt name appears repeatedly in the Dutch Buffalo Creek and Daniel's Congregation Church registers alongside Barringer and Ramsauer families, with marriages between these households recorded across multiple successive generations. The clustering itself is a meaningful piece of the evidence. These were not isolated German families scattered thin among English-speaking neighbors, the way a single surname sometimes was in other parts of the backcountry. They were a genuine, largely self-contained community that married within itself for decades before that pattern gradually loosened into the wider Piedmont population around them. Family members were among the founding lay leaders of the local German Reformed congregations that eventually organized into a formal synod, a level of institutional record-keeping that, again, mostly survives in translated German church books rather than in any county office. 10. Dellinger, another well-documented name from that same Lincoln and Catawba County German belt, appearing in land grants and militia rolls alongside the Reinhardt, Ramsauer, and Barringer families throughout the second half of the 1700s. Some Dellinger descendants stayed in textile and milling trades in the same counties for generations afterward, a continuity that is unusually traceable precisely because the community stayed put in one place rather than scattering further west or south, the way a lot of backcountry families eventually did once the frontier moved on without them. The family's original land grants sat along the South Fork of the Catawba River, the same waterway that powered the mills and later the textile mills that kept the German settlement belt economically tied together well into the 20th century. 11. Shuford, originally recorded in some surviving documents as Shuford or Shufort, before English clerks gradually settled the spelling into its modern form. The family appears among the German Lutheran congregations of Catawba County, with later descendants becoming prominent in the region's ironworking and textile industries through the 1800s, a documented economic rise that historians of the area have traced from the original farmland grants forward. If your surname is Shuford with roots in that part of North Carolina, the German Lutheran Church records specifically, rather than the county courthouse alone, are where the earliest generations of the family actually show up on paper. Descendants later helped establish some of the earliest iron furnaces and forges in that stretch of the Piedmont, industries that grew directly out of the same farmland their immigrant ancestors had originally cleared by hand a couple of generations earlier. 12. Campbell. Here the story shifts entirely away from the Wagon Road and away from the Scots-Irish Presbyterian world altogether. Highland Scot families carrying the Campbell name sailed directly into Wilmington and settled around Cross Creek starting in the 1730s and 40s, part of what is often called the Argyll colony, Gaelic-speaking and largely unconnected to the Presbyterian network filling the Waxhaws at roughly the same moment in time. When the Revolution came, a considerable number of these Highland families, Campbell's prominently among them, sided with the Crown rather than against it, a loyalty that historians trace partly to formal oaths. A number of these families had sworn to the British government after the failed Jacobite rising back in Scotland a generation earlier. At the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in February of 1776, a Loyalist force built substantially out of these Highland Scot backcountry families marched toward the North Carolina coast to link up with British troops and was defeated before it ever got there, a defeat that effectively ended organized Loyalist military activity in the colony for years afterward. If your Campbell line traces to the Cape Fear or Cross Creek region rather than the Waxhaws or Mecklenburg, you are looking at a genuinely different wartime political story than a Campbell family settled further inland. Roughly 1,600 Loyalist militia are estimated to have marched toward the coast that February, and a good number of the Campbells and their neighbors who survived the defeat later chose exile over reconciliation entirely, resettling after the war in Nova Scotia and other parts of British North America, rather than staying in a country that had just defeated them. 13. McNeil, also recorded in English-language sources as McNeil. Part of that same Argyll colony settlement around Cross Creek, the name appears in Cumberland County land records and militia lists on the Loyalist side of the same conflict that split the backcountry down the middle. Flora MacDonald, the Highland Scot woman already famous back in Scotland for helping Bonnie Prince Charlie escape after the disaster at Culloden, was living near Cross Creek at the exact time of Moores Creek Bridge, and her own family's Loyalist sympathies during that campaign are well documented in the surviving correspondence and later pension claims of Loyalist veterans seeking compensation from the Crown after the war ended. That gives some real sense of just how directly this specific community carried its old world politics across the ocean and straight back into a new one, largely unchanged. The name itself survives today under several spellings: McNeil, 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 and occasionally simply Neil, all descending from the same Gaelic original, which means a researcher tracing this specific line needs to search every variant rather than assuming a single fixed spelling the way an English surname more often allows. 14. Kershaw. Joseph Kershaw was an English merchant, not Scots-Irish, not German, not Highland Scot, who built a trading post and mill on the Wateree River that grew, within a couple of decades, into the town of Camden, the Backcountry's most important market center by the 1770s. Kershaw's stores and warehouses connected the German farmers of Lincoln and Rowan, the Scots-Irish settlers of the Waxhaws, and the low country markets down on the coast into a single functioning economy, which is easy to overlook until you consider that none of the other 13 names on this list had anywhere nearby to actually sell a wagon load of wheat, hemp, or deerskins without a town like Camden existing in the first place. Camden later became a British headquarters during the Southern Campaign, and the Battle of Camden in August of 1780, a serious and costly defeat for the Continental Army, was fought essentially in the Kershaw family's own backyard, close enough that the family's own mills and warehouses were pressed into service by the occupying British Army. If your surname is Kershaw with Camden area roots, the family sits at the economic center of this entire backcountry story, rather than at its military or religious edges. In an irony that shows up in more than one local history, the British occupying army eventually arrested Kershaw himself on suspicion of quietly favoring the Patriot cause and shipped him off to Bermuda for a stretch of the war, meaning the merchant whose town the British had just made their own regional headquarters spent part of that same occupation as their prisoner rather than their host. 14 names, and they split cleanly along the lines the geography set up at the start of all this. Calhoun, Pickens, Jackson, Polk, Alexander, and Craighead carry the Scots-Irish Presbyterian world of the Waxhaws and Mecklenburg. Barringer, Ramsauer, Reinhardt, Dellinger, and Schuford carry the German Reformed and Lutheran settlement belt of Lincoln, Catawba, and Cabarrus. Campbell and McNeil carry the Highland Scot Argyll colony around Cross Creek, a community whose wartime loyalties ran opposite to nearly everyone else on this entire list. And Kershaw sits by himself, an English merchant whose trading post tied all three of the other worlds together into one working economy, without which none of the other stories would have had anywhere to sell a harvest. Taken together, the 14 names sketch out a backcountry that was never the simple, single-minded frontier its own later mythology sometimes suggests, but a working patchwork of separate communities who happened to share 100 miles of Piedmont ground, and eventually, a war neither side fully agreed on. If any of these names are sitting in your own family tree, the actual research starts in a few specific places. For the Scots-Irish Presbyterian families, the Presbyterian Historical Society holds session records from congregations like Sugaw Creek and Rocky River going back into the 1750s, and a number of these have been indexed and made searchable in recent years. For the German families, look specifically for surviving church books rather than county deeds first, since Lutheran and Reformed congregations in Lincoln and Catawba counties often preserved German language registers that county courthouses never touched at all, and several have since been translated and indexed by local historical societies over the past few decades. For the Highland Scot Cross Creek families, Cumberland County's own colonial records and the Argyll colony research maintained by North Carolina genealogical groups are the right starting point, and it is worth searching under both the original Gaelic spellings and their anglicized forms, since English-speaking clerks who had never heard Gaelic before wrote down whatever they thought they were hearing. And for any family with deep roots in the Old 96 District or the Camden area specifically, South Carolina's Department of Archives and History holds land grant and militia records that predate the state's own modern county boundaries entirely, which trips up a lot of researchers who go searching under whatever present-day county happens to sit on that same ground today. And for anyone whose ancestors served in the militia on either side of these backcountry fights, both the sons of the American Revolution and, for the Loyalist names specifically, the surviving British Claims Commission records filed after the war, are worth checking directly, since a defeated Loyalist filing a compensation claim in London often had to describe his American property, his neighbors, and his own service history in more detail than most Patriot pension files ever required. One last thing worth sitting with, because it is easy to lose inside a list like this one. The backcountry was not one community. It was several, living within 100 miles of each other, worshipping in different languages, and in more than one documented case fighting directly against each other when the revolution finally arrived at their doorsteps. A Scots-Irish Presbyterian family from the Waxhaws and a Highland Scot family from Cross Creek could both trace their own roots back to Scotland within a generation or two of each other, and still end up on opposite sides of what was, in the backcountry specifically, as much a civil war fought between neighbors as it was a war fought against a distant king across an ocean. If your family carries any of these 14 surnames, the backcountry records are very likely still sitting somewhere right now, in a church book, a militia payroll, or a colonial land grant application, waiting to tell you not just where your people actually came from, but which side of that particular argument they were standing on when it finally mattered, and how far 100 miles of Piedmont ground could actually stretch between two families who otherwise looked, on paper, almost identical. Some of those records will confirm exactly what your own family has always said about itself. Others, especially among the Highland Scot names, tend to surprise people who grew up assuming their ancestors were simply patriots by default, the way so much popular memory of this era assumes everyone eventually landed on the winning side. The paper trail does not care which version of the story your family has always preferred. It simply sits there, waiting for someone to actually open the book. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.